Coming up on Kismet.
And how do I honour Andy's legacy in a way that is beautiful and healthy?
Welcome to the Kismet podcast, where we explore your world of post-divorce reinvention, connection, and your pursuit of passion. Join us as we navigate love's second act. Wow. So welcome to the Kismet podcast, where we embark on a journey through the complexities of enduring long-term relationship breakdowns and the transformative power within. Today we're joined by a truly remarkable guest, Vashti Whitfield, an author, coach, speaker and documentary maker specialising in the art of transformation. The word transformation perfectly encapsulates the essence of our discussion today. It's the moment when life takes an unexpected turn, when we think we're heading in one direction but find ourselves in an entirely different path. This path could be the dissolution of a long-standing relationship, or as in Vashti's case, something contextually distinct and profoundly challenging, the loss of her beloved husband, Andy. A change so profound it's hard to fathom. With remarkable courage, you and Andy embarked on making a documentary together, a gift to us all, demonstrating that even in the depths of loss, there can be purpose. In loss, there's room for learning and growth. Their narrative now, intrinsically intertwined with Vashti's own narrative, is more than just inspiring, it's a legacy in its own right. Welcome, Vashti. We're deeply grateful for your presence here today. Can you just share a little bit about your relationship with Andy?
Yes, I can. My relationship with Andy I always describe us as, you see those two cats like lounging around, wound around each other, lolling in the sun. And we were kind of very much those two felines that would wrap around each other and just respond and react and go where the kind of sun shone, metaphorically speaking. And so we had this fantastic relationship that in fact was purposeful, powerful, poignant, filled with all sorts of wild and wonderful adventures, internally and externally. And then the unimaginable happened, and my relationship with Andy was, I don't want to say cut short, because I'm really mindful of the language that is relatable to loss and death, but actually he died. And all of a sudden, I've now lived with a second relationship with Andy, which is what is my relationship with Andy now that he's gone? So I call it like the before and the after relationship with Andy.
And what is the after?
I would say that when you have had somebody who has been in your life consistently as, I guess, a best friend, a mentor, a partner in crime, a collaborator, when they're no longer there, at first you feel a little bit like you have had a body part amputated. I always call it a sort of a limp, a significant limp, and you kind of wobble all over the place. But the interesting thing is where the wobbles happen, for me, Andy is always about course correcting. My relationship with him now is about checking in with, what would he say? Or what would he expect of me? Or what would I have done with him here? How would Andy have handled this situation with my son? And so it's this kind of constant, it sounds really cliche, but it's like having this rudder. And it also calls you to lean into the potential of all situations because you get to be here. And that's how I describe on a very superficial level my relationship with Andy, who is no longer physically here.
Yeah, I really like that description you've just given. I think very different to divorce, where there's a sense of grief and a sense of loss, but the partner, in my instance, divorced, but my ex is still around. I can approach him. I can have conversations with him. My children can have conversations with him. And I had this sense that there are no conversations after death. But it sounds like you are having conversations, that there is this continual communication and sense of Andy's presence. Which
actually, can I interrupt you there?
Probably misunderstood.
I really want to be clear about this for me, because there are very different relationships with the death of somebody in their presence.
Yeah.
And want to honor that we all have different ways of making meaning about somebody's presence. You know, a piece of music might play and you go, oh my gosh, I feel him everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's like, from a science perspective, I really sit between two. I'm very spiritual and consciously minded. And at the same time, I also work with the brain and I'm very aware of what triggers neurologically, senses and smells and feelings. So there are often synchronicity. You know, you'll coincidentally be thinking about him and you'll walk in and there'll be that track playing that when he was house sitting your place and you were in New York working, and it will bring this extraordinary flood of memories and you'll go, oh, I keep thinking a lot about Andy today. Whereas somebody else would verbalize that as his presence was strong today. And so I want to invite anyone to experience that in any way possible. And for me, what is there is more the honoring of him, honoring how he would show up, hearing the giggle and how he would find something amusing, and then making sure that I communicate that to my children. So if we're sitting over the breakfast table and something would be funny, like something crude or hilarious, I would say to my cubs, as I call them, Dad would have found this hilarious. And so that's very much the presence of Andy for me is how do we honor him and bring his memory and his mannerisms and his attraction or way of seeing things into the room.
So the children were really young when Andy died, and so I think those conversations must be incredibly important and validating for them to know that their dad's still honoured, and also meaningful for you, and also as a legacy to them that their dad did exist. I know you're an incredible coach, and part of your title includes the word legacy, life, leadership, legacy. And so as a legacy to your children, those conversations seem meaningful. What does legacy mean for you?
In the context of honouring legacy, when you're raising children or small children or teenage children, when one of the parents has died, it is often the case that we think it's too sad to talk about them. So we'll often park it, or we won't say something because we're fearful of upsetting them. But with kids, they're in the moment, they're in the present. So it's about having this mindful balance of what do you share to bring that person back into the room, and remembering, as I had to learn through somebody else, was that it's okay to share sadness, but it's also important to share the joy or the funny bits or the conversations or the inappropriate jokes or the things that that person may have done if they were in the room. So it was always a critical piece for me to weave their dad and his personality into the fabric of who they were growing up to be. Because we know that from a certain age, your memory is limited.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's always been a commitment of what do I share? What photographs do I have? What do I weave into their memories, almost with conscious choice, so that there are these imprints.
Yeah.
Because having made a documentary about the last year of his life, and there being enormous footage of him being this, incredible, ripped, six-pack, sword-yielding superhero almost, playing Spartacus, what that means is what they have access to is either this version of their father who is a sort of celebrity or hero figure, and or this person who is usually with a bald head fighting cancer, and I use that word loosely, fighting, but going through cancer, and they're very little and it's unrelatable. So it's been a really important piece from a legacy perspective while they're younger, and even now as a 16 and an 18-year-old, how do I hold space to allow them to cultivate their own memories of him through what I've planted, that are the subtle pieces and the funny, cheeky pieces, and then also hold space for them if they are going to see him through his illness as young adults now watching the documentary, and or what does my son and my daughter think seeing this kind of sex symbol Spartacus character, and then not feeling pressured, especially for my son who is his doppelganger, and everyone always says you're just like your father, and are you going to be? So to just hold space for what's the legacy Andy would have wanted to leave? If I'm the mum and the parent and the caregiver, what do I share and what do I set boundaries around? Not protecting them from, but creating a timeline for them to be ready to absorb so that they can and do create their own picture of their father.
Yeah, beautiful. That's so thoughtful and mindful. And in what you just said, you said you learnt from some others around you and all the people around them. You know, Jesse looks so much like his dad. So did you find after Andy passed with such young children, you had support around you? How did you come to this place of legacy?
When you're in the depths of grief and it being non-linear but staged and you know, there can be simultaneous stages happening, it's an intuitive process, but also I'm an avid learner. So my way of, I guess, leaning straight into one of the stages, which is finding purpose and meaning in loss and turning pain into something purposeful, was to really understand it. Mm-hmm. So I kind of dived nose deep whilst waking up at 2 a.m. in floods of tears, snot coming out of my nose, thinking, could I have done this differently? How could he still be here? You know, going through the sort of bartering stage would be simultaneously looking at how do I understand what grief is, what I'm going through, what psychologically the kids are going through, and how do I honor Andy's legacy in a way that is beautiful and healthy, that honors the continuum of his life and what his worth is. And him having been somebody that was in the public eye as a very specific figure, but also who he was to everyone that loved him, it felt very important to me that along with nurturing the cubs and rearing them and facilitating their navigation of us becoming 4 to 3 and being allowed to be kids and not being kind of constantly avalanched with how sad it was their father died when they were like, yeah, I'm playing basketball under the jacaranda and I'm having a great time today. So they don't always want that. So whilst holding space for them, for me it was, okay, this is a guy that was such a shy guy that went from shy engineer to overnight, well, not overnight, a long, slow and build to actually doing something that many people said wasn't possible, to finally kind of living the dream in a loincloth, rolling around with lots of kind of shiny, beautiful women and getting to act instead of being an engineer, which is something he never dreamed of. So there was a point for me with like, how do I continue that growth journey that he was on, inspiring other people to defy the odds or to do things that they never thought they could do? How do I take the baton and carry that on? And so honoring his legacy meant I also had to step up to the table. So I started a blog, literally very transparently and candidly sharing my grief, or just rambles and writing in the middle of the night when I felt in absolute despair, or when I'd wake up in the morning and roll over and forget again that he wasn't there and kind of relive that absolute disbelief of the loss all over again. I had to find this creative outlet to honor his creativity, but also to honor the continuum of his legacy. And that came out in a blog, that came out in writing a book, that came out in working with our brilliant documentary maker and his previous manager and the Stars Network to fulfill a documentary, which was going to ultimately be, bizarrely, almost as big as the TV show that he ended up doing. But instead of being a sort of extraordinary hero of strength and virility, he became a beautiful, vulnerable father who was getting ready to tell his children that he'd never see them again. And to make that a documentary with obviously the drivers being Lilibet Foster and Sam Maydew behind it, bringing something to life that would honor his legacy, that I could work with, that I could then do my work with, to consistently bring this whole conversation of legacy into the next iteration.
Yeah, which through that time, to have the foresight is completely remarkable, that you're thinking about legacy as you're going through the trauma of the person closest to you dying. And so as a carer of somebody who was going through that, there would have been challenges. You wrote a blog. What else was happening around you? Did you have friends, family? How did you get through that time?
Leading up to his death through his illness, and then becoming all of a sudden overnight a solo parent, the provider, the breadwinner, but also somebody who had lost their rock and their anchor, my vulnerabilities came up. So what I notice is that, if you Google me, there's this very inspiring story of this wife and this widow.
Yes.
And it is that. Mm-hmm. But then there's this other side of what was going on underneath, and with that deep loss. So there are all the things we do as a fierce lioness and a protector to provide for our children, to honor our beautiful husband's legacy, to consciously learn and give back to a broader community, to make meaning and purpose of what's happened for you. And then underneath is the lost little girl, the woman alone again, who'd spent so long alone until she found that partner and thought she'd found that person. And what starts to come up is like deep, dark pain, or all those old patterns or cycles that you perhaps had as a younger person or a younger woman, and they start to rear. It's a little bit like or harpies, or some, if you go close to the water's edge and it's dark and murky down there. And so there was this duality of, like, in the light, when the sun came up, when I could run at the beach in the morning, or where I could turn that pain into something creative and purposeful. It's the thing you read about if you read about me. Yeah. But underneath, there was this deep pain and deep loss and deep fear of being alone without that person that represented perhaps the love or the care that you missed as a child and replaced for you, or the aloneness that we feel in our 20s or as late teens or early. All of a sudden, those things start to come up. So navigating those parts, which we can talk about if you want to, was some of the darkest times.
Look, I knew this would be sensitive today. I've been doing other podcast sessions where I'm talking about divorce, and this is sensitive, and I feel like I'm holding this precious gift that you've given me by coming to speak to me today. And I certainly don't want to take you to a place that feels dark when, as you've said, there's been so much transformation. You've made so much purpose and meaning out of this loss. So I'm happy to move forward.
Absolutely not. Life is about light and shade. So when I use the word dark, I don't mean don't go there territory. I mean in the shadows. We've all got shadows. So one of the things that happens when we're in grief is it at times there is extraordinary light.
Yes.
It takes a while to find that. What I'm talking about when I talk about dark is the place where we feel most alone, and what we are called to do when we're unable to sit in the discomfort of our pain.
Yes.
And, I call that chapter something like the barista, the baker, and the Italian waiter. And, there's a period after my gorgeous late husband passed away where there was seeking refuge in a warm body as opposed to a cold one.
Yes.
And in the dead of the night, so I was always absolutely staunchly and always have been committed to not needing another person, but allowing that space to happen when the time is right, and to never ever impacting my children with the presence of somebody else until it was appropriate. And that is actually only just happening now, nearly, a decade later. So there was definitely this sense of when we feel such pain, we are moved to try and feel something else. And so through a seeking of some kind of intimacy, that definitely led me down a path of almost giving myself up. It reminded me of my younger years, when we're seeking love, when we're seeking connection, and we think that we're going to get that through physical connection without really taking or paying attention to the fact that the person that we're sharing energy and physical space with and intimacy with is someone that we wouldn't really want to even share a conversation with.
Yeah, and you have needs as well. And you talk about, the Italians after Andy passed. Just, if you can, just touch on what it was like before Andy passed, and intimacy and sex. And something you just talked about was the sex, the physicality. That's not necessarily intimacy. They're very different things. And so with Andy, before he died, as his carer, there's so much that you would be taking on. The children, being a nurse, effectively, a doctor, all kinds of things. How did sex and intimacy happen towards the end of Andy's life?
Well, if we sort of stage it through rounds of treatment, because when you're going through chemotherapy or radiotherapy, depending on the level, there are many different variables, and so through those sort of treatment periods, there are peaks and troughs and ups and downs of energy. So at first there's this beautiful intimacy, because obviously there's this holding on and this embracing of and this adoration and gratitude for when life is threatened. And so there's a desire to be even more closer from an intimacy, from a touch, from a holding, from a caring for perspective. And then from a physicality, when you are also, as I was then, rearing two young, also going through privately the thoughts of anticipatory grief, where you felt incredibly disloyal by even allowing yourself, to think about what would happen if they didn't survive. But in that way we do, as every partner does when they are then going to take care of the young, our brain automatically does. It's a risk assessment, and we're preparing ourselves. So from a sexual perspective and a desire for that with that person, that lessened in certain stages, because you're so overwhelmed with caring and considering that physically that didn't come up. And yet in the same breath, when it became overwhelming, there was without doubt the desire to act out on occasions. And with that desire to just sabotage, to just kind of lose yourself in somebody else and pretend you aren't the partner or the carer or the mother, to be that person that has no responsibilities, that can meet a stranger in the street and spend an hour or 20 minutes or whatever and then leave. And so those thoughts and feelings came up, but having an awareness that is a tendency for me in my younger years to act out with sex and intimacy in search of love, I was aware when it was coming up. And luckily I had a really, really open communication relationship with Andy, and at those beginning stages talked about those different things. And then when his energy did come back, we would definitely, because as many people know, when you are going through chemo or you are in, very, very later stages of illness, to get an erection is like a big deal. I mean, there's a piece of footage in our documentary where Andy's strumming the guitar and I'm sending an email and he says, "What is it you're doing?" And I said, "I'm just updating on everybody on where we're at." And he said, "Oh, read me what you've written." And I said, "The sun is shining. We've both got smiles on our faces because today Andy had a boner and we put it to good use." And he says, "Thank you so much for sharing that with everyone, darling." And I said, "It's good news." And he said, "Yeah, it's great news." So it's that thing of celebrating what you can do when you can do it. And, he often used the line, "Darling, thank you for the sympathy shag," knowing that he wasn't his full Spartacus virility. But at that stage, for me, and I'm not saying this is for everybody, and I do want to speak about that was enough. I also want to say that it's so dependent on the relationship you have with that person and how you communicate about sex and intimacy even before the illness. Andy and I were best friends. I described us as like these two cats, and you see them fighting. I remember getting into bed when Andy was shooting Spartacus and he was exhausted. I was exhausted because I'd been rearing two little people, solo. And we were like, we should have sex right now. We should have a bonk because we haven't seen each other since 5 a.m. or we haven't. And we were like, "Do you feel like it?" "No, I'm too tired." Okay. And then we would have a race to climax by ourselves beside each other because we both wanted to. And we were like best friends. It was probably like two teenage boys in a dorm, right? With their box of tissues. We were, and I share very openly here because I want to say that we had a relationship where we could talk about sex, and sometimes it was about making love together. Sometimes he would say, who were you thinking about? That you were off somewhere else then. And I said, do you want me to tell you? I was thinking about a construction worker, So we had that relationship where we didn't take things personally, which is why I was totally capable of, having this beautiful partner roll around with all these gorgeous actresses naked, because it was never about the physicality. It was about the intimacy in our relationship. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to say about that is that allowed us to talk about things, and for him to also understand sometimes my darkness and sadness in his illness, and for us to be able to talk about that and his lack of ability to be able to be physical, and for us to be able to talk about that and hold space for that, as opposed to just not speaking about it. Yeah. And again, I wanted to reiterate that, because for anybody in a relationship thinking about what sex and intimacy is, if we cannot have an open communication with our partner, we're not being honest with each other.
On a lighter note, we kind of started about this. We started talking about Italians. So you went out and physically had some needs met, not necessarily intimacy-wise, but sexually. And you navigated that with young children by keeping it very private. And as you said, it's now decade on, 12 years, I think. And how have you shifted? How's that changed? How have you managed to get out there as your children have grown? And just talk to me about your family dynamic and you being out back in the world as somebody who's single.
When we reference Italians, I just would like to be mindful that it's not that I'm particularly selective. It was the area that I lived in, also being a primary parent and caregiver to then two young children. There just happened to be a lot of really wonderful coffee shops and beautiful Italian restaurants with very lovely, just fresh off the boat, young Italians who seem to, or not young, but, Italians who seem to have this passion for the archetypal widow young mama with kids, and this deep respect for, unlike, the Australians who tend to go for the youthful, clean-lipped,
culturally different.
Yeah, very different. So I just want to be clear about why
I didn't
Italian.
want to box you into that either.
What was really fascinating about those earlier years, becoming a woman again who wasn't married or partnered, there was this strange, I'm going to call it, and not necessarily wanted, freedom. So the one relationship prior to my very serious relationship now, many years ago, which happened way too soon, in the full throes of grief and trying to somehow provide a significant person for my children, I dived into a short-term relationship with an Italian, yes. And this is a really unusual, very kind, very beautiful man, younger than myself. And I'll never forget, and this was slow and steady, unlike myself, when I finally managed to kind of disrobe him and take his clothes off, because he was very clear that physically there was to be no physicality unless this was something of a serious nature.
Oh my goodness.
Which was totally
what a find.
Interesting, yeah, contradictory to my behaviours. But when he took his clothes off, and please be mindful, this is the first person that I had been with that I was open to the possibility of something, as opposed to acting out my sadness or my aloneness. When he took his clothes off, I'll actually never forget looking at this magnificent thing in front of me, which was just almost larger than anything I'd ever seen. And I remember looking at this big thing in front of me, and I'm not talking about his body, I'm talking about what was attached to his body. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, do I get to play with that? Because there was a feeling that I was still married. Even to this day, there is a feeling that I'm still married. And so there was this duality of like excitement and delight, a bit like sort of walking into a Lego shop and looking at what can I, and in the same breath, all I wanted to do was grab my phone, go into the other room and text my late husband to tell him what was happening. And then the reality that he wasn't there would hit. So there was this really strange duality of delight and joy and humor, because one of the jokes Andy and I used to share, in the earlier parts of his illness was, if you're going to die, do it soon enough that I'm young enough to be able to pull another hot guy. So I'm there with this beautiful, very incredibly sexy, kind
like,
man.
Andy, I did it.
With Andy, I did it. And look at the size of this penis that I'm about to play with. And then wanting to be anywhere but where I was. It should be feeling away a certain way, but it's just not. Because what's absent is the intimacy. And we mistake the physicality and the sex for intimacy when it is about as far as it possibly could be.
Yeah. And you realise that with that particular partner, that it was too early, the duality of it was probably too much to cope with?
For me, it was always about being discerning of what and who was I being and what was I drawn to and who would I ever consider introducing to my children. And with those two, that meant that there was never a rush post that first relationship. In fact, a resistance to having relationship with anyone or bringing anyone in until I'd done the work on myself that I found resurfacing post Andy dying.
And you did the work?
I've been doing the work for a long time. And I have to say, on the precipice of, perimenopause and COVID, where it was a time of deep introspection and it was just me and my 2 kids and the dog, it was a time where that inward turning felt overwhelming. And so it's where I really enlisted some support, definitely got back into the therapy chair and had a look at just who I was becoming, who I'd become as a result of the loss, but who I'd grown into being. And it was almost like I had to really do the hard work alone again to get to the bottom of who I needed to be and respect myself for being in order to bring the appropriate person into my world. Someone that I would not be a carer of, which is my habit, or an empowerer to, but actually someone that can meet me and give me an equal amount to I gave them.
A benefit to your life. You're such an incredible human. You would have to have somebody bring benefit into your life in order for it to be a meaningful relationship, I'm guessing.
I think we don't know what does bringing benefit to our life mean.
Well, they add rather than take. And as a carer, it's an incredible gift to be able to care for somebody. Not everyone can be a carer. It is an incredible gift, but it's depleting at the same time. And so to add benefit it's adding to your life. It's not taking away. Your relationship with your children isn't diminished. Nothing about you becomes diminished. You're better because of the person that you're bringing in. And has that happened?
It's a really interesting piece, that who we attract in and what we're attracted to. Because when I first met somebody that I thought for a moment, I'm ready. And I'm ready because I'm finding myself at least 3 nights a week having just made dinner and neither of my cubs are at home. And just in that moment, I realized that between my wonderful clients, which, really fill a huge space in terms of learning, growth, intimacy, as much as, I can say that in the work that I do, I suddenly found myself realizing I was either parenting my kids or working. And so I realized that I needed to create a life, and that perhaps there was a window of wanting to share that with somebody else. I didn't want to be out with more friends or out doing it. It was more that I'd like to be in, but I'd like to be sharing that with somebody.
Yeah.
And then somebody, of course, just when you're ready, presented themselves. And at the beginning of that relationship, I looked at them, and at first I was deeply attracted to all that they were. And then I started to look for the holes. And I started to look for what my core values were. And I could see so clearly in certain ways that they behaved that they weren't aligned with my value. I turned around to them and I said, this is not going to work because you're not a great communicator and I need communication. And I need you to use more than good as a descriptive term for how your day has been. And I started looking for all the holes. And this person turned around to me, not having done an enormous work on themselves in terms of, self-reflection, coaching, therapy, all of those things that we perhaps put in our list of have-tos. We're looking for the ideal partner. And they turned around and said, it's really interesting that you're telling me communication is your key value, because if you don't want this, just say, but stop coming back and forth.
Oh, wow.
And in that moment, just as Andy did, which was one of the most powerful things and uniting things that we did for each other, which was hold each other accountable with love, I was held accountable for my lack of awareness. And it was in that moment that I realized that we have these aspirations for who that person is, perhaps for the person we were when we were looking in our 20s and our 30s. And what I realized was this person looking at me with such love and wanting to care so much, with so much adoration and respect and deep love for who I was and who I wasn't and who I'd been, who'd been watching me for a long time and seeing the challenge that I was going through. What I suddenly realized is what I wanted and needed was exactly who they were. But I had these values locked in stone of what I thought a relationship was supposed to be in terms of co-creativity. You know, we should write books together. But what I realized is actually, no, I need to be on downtime with them when I'm with this person. And I need them to take control and take us off on adventures instead of me doing everything. So I had to put down my control freak. I had to put down my rule book around and I had to really look at what is it, as you said, that was going to add value, not just to my life, but to love.
And now you're on this path with him. How long's that been, if you're happy to talk about that, and how's that been for your children to have somebody maybe for the first time come into their lives?
What's been and always will be for both he and me is that our children are a priority. And mine are a little younger, so they take a little bit more consideration in terms of they live in the household. And for me, I never really brought him into the picture. They were aware in a very sweet way because they were like, "Where are you going, Mum?" And I was like, "I'm going out with this new friend." And they were like, "Fantastic, Mum. Who is it?" Because they were in a place where at one point they were saying, "Are you staying in again, Mum?"
Oh.
However, for me, I still was absolutely rigid is the wrong word, but committed to not bringing somebody into their life, even as an introduction, until I was really clear that I was willing to explore something bigger, deeper with this person. So they were only introduced on to the scene as a friend, nothing more, having a cup of tea, as I grew the relationship. And it was only in very recent months that I started to let them know that I was having a relationship with somebody, and it was that person, but I kept it outside of the house for a really long time. And it was only when I sat down with my kids and said, "Look, how do you feel about me having a sleepover? How do you feel about this person having a sleepover with us?" Not as a group,
yes.
Obviously.
Yes.
And it was giving them the opportunity to say yes and no. You know, so over the time, and it still is that way, I will say, "Is it okay if that person or I go there?" And they're like, "You don't have to ask permission anymore." But for now, I still do. But it's very clear for them that there is a relationship, but there's still an element. And what is wonderful by this person is that they so deeply respect that. And we're respectful of each other's situations in a way that it's slow and steady. There's no hurry. You know, I've got that. I'm a recovering codependent. I did that with the young Italian, you know, where I brought him into the fold too quickly, and it was the lesson I needed to learn, where I was not committed to it. It was a sense of need. And so with this particular person, the slow and steady, the respect of, they're both understanding each other's situations. I see this very frequently where the two partners come together post a death or a divorce. One has children, one doesn't. It takes time to understand that often the children are a priority. And for me and my partner, that he has never questioned that. In fact, he will put it out there more than I will. He'll say, I think perhaps I should, not come over this evening just to give you guys space.
I love that. So aligned.
And aware of what is most important. And sometimes you've got to do things that are challenging as well. You've got to have the tough conversations. You've got to perhaps not be the good guy in certain situations to move things forward. But it's all about what's the right pace for les enfants.
Yeah, you're navigating this new life incredibly. And I'm so grateful that you've been able to come here today and share this with us. I could talk to you for hours. Literally, I feel like we've only touched the surface of so much more. But thank you so much for coming today.
My pleasure.
Wish you all the best, and the children and your new partner. Go forward and with love.
Thank you.
Don't miss an episode. Hit subscribe where you're getting this. Follow our socials and ask any questions on my new website, where we're building for like-minded people wanting to reconnect.